Question number 9, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I seek leave, please, to hold this question over until the day when the Minister is present?
I will put the leave and then the House will decide. Leave is sought to hold this question number 9 over to another day. Is there any objection? There is objection. The Honourable David Parker, question number 9.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Does he stand by his statements in this House regarding a $4 million payment to a Saudi Arabian businessman that, quotes, the New Zealand government was also exposed to a legal claim for up to $30 million, quote, in quotes, and when asked for an example of a similar payment, quotes, I cannot point to any such example?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Chris Finlayson.
On behalf of the Minister, yes, when the quotes contained in the member's question are considered as part of the full response that was provided.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
When he said the government was exposed to a legal claim, had he been provided any legal advice from MFAT to that effect, or to the effect that a legitimate cause of action existed?
The Honourable Chris Finlayson.
On behalf of the Minister, the Minister would have had access to an analysis of legal risk, because that's what we're talking about, a legal risk, not a claim that had been formulated. And when one is dealing with legal risk, one has to take into account a number of factors.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Why has the Minister resisted for over a year disclosing whether any relevant legal advice did in fact exist?
The Honourable Chris Finlayson.
Ultimately, on behalf of the Minister, ultimately I would have thought that the fact of legal advice and its contents were matters for the Attorney-General to determine.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I took that to be a claim that legal professional privilege questions are for the Attorney. That is not what is at issue here, sir. It's not what the advice was, it's whether any advice existed, and I think the Minister should be asked to answer that question.
No, I think on this occasion the Minister has answered it, clearly not to the member's satisfaction, but the essence of the question is why have the Minister resisted disclosure? The Minister certainly answered that. Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Did any such legal advice exist?
The Honourable Chris Finlayson.
On behalf of the Minister, I have not actually seen any legal advice because I'm holding the fort, as it were, but the point is that there was an assessment by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs dealing with a range of matters, and ultimately it was a risk assessment that needed to be determined.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Has anyone in MFAT, including the Minister, been provided with any part of the draft Auditor-General's report on her inquiry over a year long into the Saudi sheep deal?
The Honourable Chris Finlayson.
Well, on behalf of the Minister, the member in his question seems to be suggesting that the Auditor-General is taking an unduly lengthy period of time to determine this matter. The member should know, because he's an experienced member in this House, that the Auditor-General is an independent officer. She will conduct an inquiry and then a draft report would be given to those who are affected to enable them to comment so that natural justice questions were determined.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Sir, the essence of that question, and there weren't two parts to it, was had anyone in the Ministry been provided with a draft of the Auditor-General's report? I don't see why the Minister can't address that.
The difficulty is the question then included a comment from the questioner that the Auditor-General had commenced this inquiry over a year ago, I think were the words the member used. So the Minister took the opportunity to respond to that part of the question. If I could have more concise questions, I think it helps the House deliver the answer. On this occasion, I will allow the member an additional question. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, the Minister has not answered the question I asked or even addressed it. The point as to the length of the report wasn't a question about whether that is a year long. it's an indisputed question of fact that it is. The question was, has a draft report been provided?
And if the member would only refer to Standing Orders 380, the supplementary questions need to be concise. The member himself put in a qualification about the length of the time taken for the court. That gave the minister the opportunity to then latch onto that part of the question. If it wasn't there, it wouldn't have been able to be mentioned. But to advance the cause, I have given the member an extra question. I'd advise him to use it, otherwise we will move on. The Honourable David Parker,
thank you,
supplementary
Mr Speaker. I hadn't heard that when I took that point of order, I'm sorry. Has anyone in MFAT, including the Minister, been provided with any part of the draft Auditor-General's report on her inquiry into the Saudi sheep deal?
The Honourable
On behalf of the Minister, I don't know. However, in order to try and to have been helpful to the member, I did outline the standard procedure that would be undertaken by the Auditor-General making an inquiry along these lines.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, I would ask you to consider whether that's an acceptable answer, given that when ministers are answering on behalf of other ministers, they are expected to be able to answer reasonable questions from the opposition. And I think that's a pretty, in the context of this controversy, is the sort of question that I would have expected the minister should have prepared for.
I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Speaker, I think when you do consider it, as I'm sure you will, you'll reflect on the comment made previously by the member answering the question that did outline the process, which makes it abundantly clear that the member minister answering the question today could not know that answer.
I think the important thing is the Minister is acting on behalf of the Minister for Foreign Affairs. He was asked whether the draft report had been presented to MFAT and or to the Minister. The Minister acting on behalf took the position that it was clearly his honest view. He does not know. That is an answer given. I would certainly prefer that answer to one that then led to a discussion later about whether we'd had somebody misleading the House. Question number 10. Point of order, Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Without wanting to question your previous ruling on the matter of ministerial responsibility, and you reference Speaker's ruling 1913 and 4, which relate to...
Can we just have this a bit more clearly, speak into the microphone?
Sorry,
perhaps if we have the Speaker's ruling the member wants to refer to?
Well, it's Speaker's ruling 1913 and 4, which you referenced in response to the Right Honourable Winston Peters' point of order regarding ministerial responsibility and the questioning between Ron Mark and the Minister. And those points do relate to a Minister not necessarily having knowledge of what went on prior to them taking up that office, which is fair enough. But I believe that the Right Honourable Winston Peters' point of order was to do with responsibility itself. And Speaker's ruling 170/5 by Speaker Smith says that just because a Minister may not have been present at the time does not relieve a Minister of being answerable for what took place, referencing that a Minister was asked about a decision that occurred in his portfolio before he became a Minister. I'm curious as to, even given the circumstances, sir, that the fact that the Minister may not have had knowledge doesn't relieve her of that responsibility.
I'll have a look at the points that the members raised, and if necessary I'll come back to him if I decide to. Question number 10, Cunwall.
To raise it, because you always worry that someone is going to say it's just me that can't hear things, but it does appear that the sound system here is rather quiet today. Certainly was earlier when members were asking questions over there, and when you just spoke a few seconds ago, it was also very, very quiet.
Well, I'll certainly make sure that we have a look at the sound system immediately. I thank the member. Question number 10, Kanwal Singh Bakshi.